talk today will be given by Professor Sitabhra Sinha. Professor Sitabhra Sinha is a faculty member at IMSc and he did his PhD on non-linear dynamics of recurrent neural network models developed in machine intelligence here at ISI Kolkata. His areas of research fall broadly under complex systems, non-linear dynamics, and theoretical and combinational calculus. Today's talk will be on class-level communities. Network analysis reveals their weights to the logic and society.
Thanks, Kritat. Yeah. All right. So I understand that there's a big mix of backgrounds, right? So you have people from school and people from college, right? So all of you must have done some life sciences at some point. But if you have forgotten about it, don't worry. I'm not going to use any life science concepts which even someone who hasn't actually had a science education won't know. All right. This is going to be primarily about using a body of maths, which is graph theory, on the brain. Have you encountered graph theory, or has anyone not encountered graph theory before? Okay, no one has encountered graph theory, or everyone has encountered graph theory? No one has encountered graph theory. Don't worry about it either. All right. Sorry? Everyone has encountered graph theory? Okay, fantastic. All right, good. So some of the graph theory slides I've put in as kind of intro would appear redundant to you, but just humor me and please ask me questions. Okay, so you're free to stop me at any time. Doesn't matter if I can't finish the talk, but at least the part that I do cover, you should be able to understand, hopefully. All right. So something that I think everyone agrees, even if they have forgotten all their life sciences, is, well, the brain is complex. Right? I used to say that it's the most complicated kilogram of matter in the universe, but then I realized that that's kind of human centrism. And so now I just say it's the most complicated kilogram of matter that we are aware of. Right? And our ambitions at understanding the human brain kind of goes for a toss when we realized we still don't fully understand the nervous system of this lowly worm. It goes by the grand name of Caenorhabditis elegans, right? It's about 1 millimeter in length. Okay, so strictly speaking, you do need a microscope to actually see it in motion. It has about 300 neurons, which together form about 3,000 connections, which pales in comparison to the human brain, which is about 10 to the power 11 neurons, and each of those neurons have on average 1,000 connections, which makes about 10 to the power 14. Right? Now, at some point, all these numbers don't mean anything, right? I mean, what is 10 to the power 11? What does whatever 100 billion actually mean? So let's take some real numbers that we can connect with. So what's the population of the Earth? 8 billion, right? And I'm a physicist. So physicists are famous at ignoring details. So mathematicians get angry all the time at us because we take shortcuts, right? So we will always round it off to the nearest 10, right? So we will say population of the Earth is 10 billion. Okay. So that's like 10 to the power, how much? So billion is about 10 to the power 9, so it's about 10 to the power 10. Okay. All right. What is the diameter of the Earth? Anyone? Sorry? Point? Okay, so again, we will use the physicist's prerogative and round it off to 10,000 kilometers. Okay, so it's 10 to the power 4 kilometers. So which in terms of meters, so kilometer is 10 to the power 3 meters. So it will be 10 to the power 7 meters. Okay. Now, Now we want to know, like how much space is available for each human. Okay, we again, like a physicist, we ignore that their oceans comprise 70% of the Earth's surface. We assume that the entire Earth's surface is available to us to spread out. Okay, this is all physics speak. Okay, so don't take it seriously. This is, you go to a geographer and you start doing this, and you'd get kicked out. But I'm just trying to give you an idea, like how densely packed the brain is compared to, let's say, the planet Earth. Okay, so so what will be the area? So it's actually something like of the order of r square. Now there's of course a pi, okay, and you have to divide this by 2, but physicists completely ignore it. Okay, these are just factors. Okay, this dominates by far, right? So the area would be about 10 to the power 14 meters square. All right. All right. So that means how much area is available to each individual human? If you assume they are all uniformly spread out throughout the planet. Sorry? Yes. So area per human is about 10 to the power 4 by 10 to the power 14 by 10 to the power 10 meters square, which is 10 to the power 4 meters square, right? And so this is, you can think that each of us has 100 meter by 100 meter area where we can play around. Okay, so it's if all the oceans and everything was boarded over, then it doesn't look very crowded. Okay, now let's come to the brain. Okay, how crowded is the brain? Now 10 to the power 10, I'll just work with the same population of Earth. So human, the number of neurons in the human brain is 10 times or actually more than the number of people on this planet. Okay, but that doesn't tell you anything. It's only when you squeeze it down to the size of the brain that it makes you feel how compact it is. So so 10 to the power 10, it would be about the number of neurons of a, can you guess what animal would have this many numbers? So 10 to the power 11 is human, so 10 to the power 10, well, actually a mouse. Okay, so this is about a mouse brain. Okay, roughly. Okay, and what would be the diameter of the mouse brain? Just estimate. This is, you are playing a physicist game, right? Not 1 centimeter. 1 centimeter is like this, right, or something like this. Okay, so as a physicist, I would say 10 centimeter, right? It's huge compared to the body. Well, the brain is almost the entire mouse, right? Okay, so but just humor me along, right? Because the reason why I'm taking an overestimate is that even with this larger size, I will show how densely packed it is. Okay, so 10 centimeter would be the diameter, and so this means how many meters? So it's 10 to the power, sorry, any problem? Oh, so it's 10 to the power minus 1 meters, right? And so then what's the area? 10 to the power minus 2 meters square, right? Okay, so now what is the area per neuron? Sorry, 10 to the power minus 12 meters square, which means 10 to the power minus 6 meter. Sorry, exactly, right? It's 1 micron on this side. Okay, now you say, okay, how do I know that's not adequate space for a neuron? right? So this is 100 meter, 100 meter. So what's the typical dimension of a human being laterally? Yeah, like if you spread out your hand. Oh, come on. Sorry? In meters, please. Maybe we are using the metric system. Sorry? It's actually about a meter, right? So 100 centimeter, which is okay. So basically this is a meter, okay. So compared to that, we have like 100 times space on both axes to play around, okay. Lot of space, I would say. Anyway, much larger than your typical Chennai flat, right? So what about here? Do you know what would be the dimension of a typical? So a neuron is of course a very extended object, but so this is your typical high school textbook cartoon of a neuron, right? So can you guess what's the diameter of this roughly? One micron or no? Sorry, 1 micron. No, 1 micron is about what you call the E. coli bacteria. Okay, so this is actually larger than that. Okay, so E. coli and then your yeast, the yeast which you use for your bread. Okay, that has a dimension of about 10 micron, and a human cell typically would be 100 microns. Okay, so if these things don't make much sense, think about this. If the E. coli bacteria is like me, yeast is like a big truck next to me, and human cell would be this building. Okay, that's like the relative dimensions of these various cells. All right. Anyway, so 100 microns, right? And then you realize 100 micron and it only has 1 micron by 1 micron to play around with. What the heck is going on? Okay, so what's the solution? I mean, if you have the area less than what the individual size is, what do you do? No, but this says that you only have 1 micron by 1 micron area to play with, right? And your size is 100 times that, right? No. It's all mammalian cells are kind of okay. It ranges between 50 to 100 micron, but from a physicist's point of view, it's 100 micron, right? So what's the solution? You build multi-storied buildings. You build multi-storied buildings. You use the third dimension, right? And so you don't just put neurons all along the surface, you also start using the depth. Okay, so you will see that neurons basically will form layers. Okay, so you start going inside. Sorry? Precisely why? Because there's a lot of volume inside which is unused. You use the cerebrospinal fluid and so on. Actually, the part which the neuron occupies is like a very thin, you might say, skin of the brain. Okay, so you can treat it as 2-dimension, except that even that skin actually has about 6 layers or so of neurons. Okay, but by using this multi-story concept, you don't have neurons going all the way down. Okay, it's a bit like in Earth. Okay, we don't use the volume. Okay, but we are still using a little bit of the third dimension. We build multi-storied buildings, right? So it's exactly like that. Okay, we can't use most of the depth of the brain because you have all the cerebrospinal fluid and all the support cells. See, neurons are like the tip of the iceberg. It's about 10% of the human brain. Okay, although they are like occupying the like most of the attention. it's like human society again, like, 10% of the people occupying 90% of their attention, right? Most of the cells in a neuron are actually serving other purposes. So there would be like, cells which basically send blood and fluids. There will be cells which provide immunity. There will be cells which essentially act as the support structures. Okay. So there are lots of things going on in the brain other than simply the neurons sending information to and fro. Okay. So this is, like gives you a sense of how, but even with multi-storage structures, you can see how tightly packed the brain is, right? And the human brain would be about one order of magnitude more complex. And so even though we know exactly what the neurons are here, where they are located, who they are connected with, even then we have no clue how activity on this network results in this worm actually figuring out where food is, going there, having it, protecting itself from predators and so on. Okay. And so our dreams of understanding the human brain will never be realized until we understand at least this part. Yeah. Excellent question. So this brings us to the question of what is the smallest nervous system we can have. It turns out that you can't have a nervous system with 10 neurons, okay, or 20 neurons or 50 neurons. Okay. And the reason, as far as we understand, is this: neurons are like American cars. They're gas guzzlers. Okay. They're hugely energy consuming. You don't want to have a nervous system unless that nervous system actually does something which is a matter of life and death. Okay. So simple organisms which, in order to convey information from one point to another, can just use diffusion. Molecules can just diffuse from one point to another. So you're using chemical signaling, right? So you just let chemicals diffuse from one end to the other. And this diffusion can occur, in scales of seconds or minutes. You just stay with diffusion. It's only large multicellular organisms where if you just use diffusion, it will take hours or days to go from one point to the other. That's when you start requiring a dedicated signaling system. Okay? Because neurons are by far the most energy consuming cells that are there. Most of the sugar that we have, that all goes here. Okay. So it's taking up sugar all the time. Your body will, if you are starving, first your brain will suck up nutrition from all the rest of the body to make sure that it's functioning. Okay. So there's a reason why nervous systems are not useful if you just have 10 or 20 or 30. It's only once you have enough of them that they start doing useful stuff, and only then actually nature decides to have it. So the simplest nervous systems we know would still have about order of 100 neurons. Okay. The jellyfish is, for example, a wonderful example. They are one of the simplest nervous systems we know of. Okay. And they use that to basically detect which is up, which is down, so that they can go up during the day and sink down to the bottom during the night. Okay. But if it but don't get cocky or human. We actually don't quite, okay, because there's a lot of, because jellyfishes are a very special kind of organism, so they use hydrostatic pressure in very creative ways to move up and down, and that's so different from the human experience that it's kind of has a biology of its own and so on. So it kind of is very optimally designed for its environment. Okay. And so any insights we get from jellyfishes don't normally translate to studying the brains we are more familiar with. And just to tell you a fun fact, in one of the few cases where Marvel Comics actually got it right, was Dr. Octopus. The octopus actually has 9 brains. Each of its arms has a nervous system of its own, which are autonomous. It can actually function independently. Okay. And it has a coordinating brain at the center, which now actually takes all of it. So if you remember Spider-Man 2 from way back, when you had Dr. Octopus's, he actually fixed all this 8 arms with some neural network and had a cyber link to make sure that it doesn't take him over, and when it broke, that's when he became evil. Actually, it sounds horrible, but the octopus actually has 8 separate brains in its arms, and this one single central brain to coordinate all of it. They're not very different from Dr. Octopus. Okay? But it makes you wonder, what kind of conscious experience does the octopus have? It's like, the split personalities that you read of, taken to so there are 9 different personalities vying in the octopus's mind, right? Just think about it. Okay, anybody seen this Split, the movie by M. Night Shyamalan? Yeah. I don't remember now how many different personalities, but it's a movie about a person with multiple split personalities. Sorry, I haven't seen it. Yeah. Okay. So a regular octopus is one with having 9 personalities. Okay. I hate to think what an octopus with split personality would look like. Okay. All right. Anyway, so going back to more mundane matters, and the problem with the brain is you got organization at all different scales. So a neuroscientist, a molecular neuroscientist, can actually spend her entire life working at the level of molecules. How do molecules actually cause a neuron to get stimulated, for example. Then a psychologist would look at the entire nervous system, okay, because he or she would be conversing with that subject, and then that means you are actually dealing with a system which is 10 to the power 11, but you're treating that entire 10 to the power 11 neurons as a black box. You don't care how it's wired, okay, you just care about the output and input, right? And systems neuroscience is trying to bridge this gap where you take insights from the level of molecules, cells, and try to see how it relates to systems and the entire nervous system, and of course failing spectacularly. So how do you study such a complex system? One approach is that, well, it's not enough to know the fact that these are made of neurons and that the neurons have employing certain molecules, okay, such as neurotransmitters and so on. We also need to know how each of these components are interacting with the other components. Okay, it's a bit like looking at a crowd. Okay, the crowd may be made out of perfectly reasonable individuals, all let's say CMI undergrads, right? And you put them all together, and they can actually have a spontaneous transformation into a riot. Okay, where they just go and smash up things. Okay, if you now take each of them individually, no harm in. I don't mean any insult to semi undergrads. I'm just taking semi undergraduates as a sample, right? But if you take individually each of them out, you'll say that they're perfectly reasonable, rational, sensible beings. Okay, you put them together, and they do start doing stuff which none of them individually would ever imagine they're capable of, right? So that's why we look at interactions, and for this we use the language of networks. So networks is just the physicists speak of saying graphs. Okay, so typically we have how do we describe a graph? So we have all these nodes, which graph theorists will call vertices, and which are connected, some of which are connected to each other through edges, which a physicist will call links, and the entire system is a graph, or a physicist will call it a network. Now typically it's very hard to actually do anything computational with this kind of a pictorial representation, so we go to this matrix representation, which is called an adjacency matrix. As the name itself makes clear, the matrix element tells you whether two elements are adjacent, that is, they have links with each other. So the corresponding adjacency matrix of this would be this. So for example, you would see that A and B are connected, and so the corresponding matrix elements would be occupied by 1. On the other hand, A and C are not connected. You can see that A and C have no direct connection, and so that will be 0. All right. Is this representation clear? Okay. And you would see that the diagonal is 0. There is it's a traceless matrix. Okay. That's because you assume that there is no self connection. All right. So now from this you can do lots of things, like for example you can try to figure out, okay, what's the number of hops you require to go from, let's say, A to G. Okay. So there's no direct connection from A to G, but if you see, you can go from A to F and then F to G. So how do you figure this out? So you take this adjacency matrix, multiply it with itself. Okay. So you have A, so you go to A square. Okay. The matrix multiplied with itself. Now you will find that this entry of A square, the AGth entry, would be 1, which means that there is a path of length 2 which connects A and G. Okay. So when you multiply A with G, A with A itself, what is happening is it's finding, or basically if there's a connection from I to J and J to K, then Aij is 1, Ajk is 1, but Aik is 0. Okay. Let's say. Now, but once you multiply A square, so this multiplied with this will give you Aik, which will give you 1. And so you can find out all the nodes which are connected by paths of length 2. Yeah. Of course, in practice, these algorithms are, I mean, what I am describing is just in principle. In practice, of course, you would use one of these dedicated algorithms. I'm just simply saying, like, in principle, just if you want to find out what is the shortest path between two elements, you just multiply A and find which is the smallest n for which a to the power n jk ik is non-zero. That will give you the shortest path. Of course, in practice, we never use this because it's way wasteful of computational resources. True. Okay. So, you might all know, of course, of this, that the science of networks had its origin in a math recreational puzzle. So, Leonhard Euler, who lived in the city of Königsberg, which is now the city of Kaliningrad in the Soviet Union, in Russia, sorry, I'm still saying Soviet Union after whatever, 30 years. So, they had these 7 bridges at that point of time. Okay. So, A, B, C, D, E, F and G. And so, something that the citizens of the city used to puzzle about is that, is it possible to walk through the city that would cross each bridge once and once only? You're all familiar with this puzzle, right? Anyone not familiar with this puzzle? Okay, right. All right, so what do you think? Could you find a path? Or how would you even approach this problem? Yeah, so you'll try out different routes, right? But the problem is that there are so many different routes possible that very soon you will get tangled up, right? So Euler came up with a fantastic way of cutting through this, trying out trial solutions. So he said, look, why don't I do this? Why don't I convert it into this abstract picture where the land masses of A, B, C and D are the nodes and the bridges which connect them correspond to edges. Okay. So, A and C are connected by 2 bridges, see, C and D. Okay. Then A and D are connected by 1 bridge, this one, okay, and so on. Now, once you convert this into a graph, you simply ask that, so what is it that you want? You want a path that goes through each link in the network exactly once. And so you say that, okay, any such path must enter as well as exit each node as it passes through, except for the first and the last nodes, because the first node you enter and the last node you basically stay there, right? Of course, the first and last node could also be the same, in which case there is no node which you only enter or exit odd number of times, right? So this says that at most 2 nodes in the network with odd degree if such a path is to exist. Okay, so if the first and the last nodes are different, then you will have 2 nodes with odd degree, because you don't have an entry matching with the exit and an exit matching with the entry. Or if the first and last nodes are the same, then actually for all nodes the entry and exit has to match, and so you'll have every node with an even number of, okay. And so if you count now the degree, you will find that this has 3, this has 3, this has 3, and this has 5, right? So all nodes have odd number of connections, which means that you cannot have such a path. So that problem is unsolvable. You cannot have such a path. Okay. So in this way, see, it's very hard to prove this otherwise, right? Because you'll have to try out all possible routes and then come to the conclusion, okay, I can't find any path, so none exist. Here, he just cut through all that thing and just showed a very elegant proof that, look, folks, you can't get such a path. Okay? Don't try it. So, using this concept of networks, we approach the brain, and we can do it at various levels. So we can do it at the level of network of neurons, where the nodes are the neurons and the links are the synapses or electrical gap junctions which connect them. So this is again that worm that I spoke about. I've just simplified it to the name C. elegans. Or you can look at the network of brain regions, and that's because for big brains like that of monkey, so macaque is actually this common monkey that you see around you, the ones which come to your house and steal your food, right? So the macaque is one of the most well-studied model organisms because its brain is pretty close to that of a human, but nobody is going to raise a ruckus except Maneka Gandhi if you cut the brain and study it, right? So for decades, the macaque brain has been studied, where people basically traced connections from one region to another region. And so here the nodes are not neurons, because remember, the number of neurons would be close to that of humans, 10 to the power 11. That's way too many for us to experimentally study. So we look at brain regions. These are anatomically identified regions which are clearly different under the microscope, and so they actually comprise different types of neurons. They're also doing different functions, and you say, okay, this region has large number of synapses going to this region has large number of neurons going to this region, and so how do you say that large number of connections going to another region? Well, like any good electrical engineer, nature has realized that if you want to take lots of connections from this region to that region, the most efficient way is to bunch together all these connections, put them in some kind of a tubing so that they don't tangle up with other connections and go through. So this basically forms this the so-called white matter of the brain. So you put it in myelin, okay, and you can clearly see this myelin sheath encoded connections all the way. So you can trace this very easily, and that's how you find out what are the connections going from one region to another region, right? So the nodes are the brain regions, and the connections are these tracts which basically connect one region to another region. So you can also study at this large scale level, okay. Now, how to characterize a network? So you can look at micro properties, right? So these are what are known as motifs. So you can ask, like, are my neighbors typically also connected to each other? So is my neighborhood cliquish? Okay. Or are my neighbors all talking to different people? Okay. Or you can look at macro properties. So you can ask, okay, how fast can I travel to the furthest point of this network? Okay. So are there shortcuts that I can use to very quickly go from any point of the network to any point of the network, which is basically looking at average path length of the graph, right? So this is a question about the entire network, whereas this is a question about just the small neighborhoods, whereas you can ask intermediate scale questions, and this is what we call meso level properties. So what meso level properties are we going to talk about? Okay. But before that, why do a mesoscale analysis? Okay, so when you are looking at a computer, you don't go down to the level of capacitors or resistors, right? You basically look at it as components which essentially themselves are very complex. So you have input devices like the keyboard and the mouse, you have the control unit, you have the central memory store, you have output devices, and you could have secondary storage and so on. Okay, and then each of these you can actually study in detail if you want to. Okay, so the CPU itself is actually pretty complex, and you can, so if you like go to electrical engineering course, for example, there'll be a course on this microprocessors, where even within that you will find that there are further modules, like each of the integrated circuits itself is actually packed full of capacitors, resistors, and so on, right? So and then you connect up all these ICs, and then you finally get the CPU and so on. And so if you coarse grain the system, you don't have to deal with the most elementary components, but rather subsystems which are themselves made out of these elementary components, which will contribute to some particular function. Okay, so this is actually a pretty useful way to look at many systems, and we find that in nature many systems are actually built in this modular fashion. Okay? So much so that when we engineer artificial objects, we actually have taken this modular approach also. So back in the days when the television first appeared in our homes, I still remember this. So whenever the TV would go on the blink, my father would call the repair person, and he would come. He would open the back of the TV. This is the time when TVs could still be repaired. You don't just go with the exchange program. So the back will open, and I'll see all kinds of like greenish boards. So these were like circuit boards. So he would take out one circuit board. He'd take one circuit board from his bag, put it in, turn on the TV. Is it working? No. Okay. Take out the next one, put the equivalent one in. Is it working? No. Okay. So then finally he would look at which board is not working. So then at some point he would put one board in, and suddenly the TV starts working. So he said he takes the defective board out, puts it in his bag, collects his fee, and goes away. Okay. So I used to ask my father, what does he do with these boards? Okay. So my father said, oh, okay, he'll just repair that board so that he can use it with the next customer. And so, I didn't know it then, but this is like, modular engineering, right? You basically have got it down to the point where the guy doesn't have to, figure out, okay, is it some resistor which is not functioning, or is some capacitor which is blown? He just takes module in and out, and the moment he figures out one module is actually defective, he just takes it. Then someone else will bother about which part of that module is not functioning. All right. So it makes for a lot of convenience. And so the kind of mesoscopic organization of networks that we look at, there are three principal types of mesoscopic organization. It could be modular. So essentially the network is built out of clusters of very densely connected subnetworks. It could be hierarchical. So the nodes could be arranged in layers, where each node is just talking to members above and members below its own level. Or it could be what is known as a core periphery network. That is, you have a group which is very densely connected to each other, and they're talking a lot, and then there are these guys which are kind of outliers. Okay, they are only talking to one or two members of this rich club or the core. And many social organizations are kind of having these kinds of properties, right? So if you look at your typical organization, you'd find that These would correspond to, let's say, divisions, where people in each division mostly talk to each other. But even when you're within your own peer group, you'll find that there are certain groups of friends, and there are the other groups of friends, and there's not that much interaction between these two groups of friends, right? You go to a canteen and this will immediately be visually obvious. Hierarchical. Well, anyone who's been in a company or whose parents have worked in a company will immediately know what hierarchy is all about. It's taken to the extreme level in the army, but even in civilian institutions, you have a hierarchy. There's someone, there's a boss, right? And then that boss has typically a boss, and so on, all the way. Okay. Core periphery is also something you have seen, right? So there are these very popular guys who are all hanging out with each other, and there are these loners, which means all of us scientists, who are kind of like very bad socially, and most of us are. Okay, there may be a few exceptions, but we would like probably be the last person to know about a party. Okay, but there are all these popular kids, typically who don't do too well at exams, but they are like the life of the party, right? And they all are friends with each other, by the way. Okay, so even our social organizations often show this core periphery structures. Right? Okay, so let's talk about hierarchy. So this again would be very familiar to you from your high school history. So this is a cartoon of typical feudal hierarchical system. So you have the king at the top, and then the king kind of has a few nobles, some of whom may be relatives, some of whom may be other highly placed aristocratic families, and so they will be the dukes and earls and so on. And each of these dukes and earls have a few knights who are under their service. Okay, and then each of these knights have been given certain parcels of land which are worked at by peasants, and the proceeds of this land go on to maintain the knights. Okay, and they in turn would provide service to their dukes and earls to fight with another duke, for example. And then finally the king has to go to war, and he asks his noble to assemble their men, and then all these knights would have to fight for the king. Right? So what is the take home message from this picture is that you have a system where nodes are placed at different levels, and the communication is mostly between a level with its adjacent level. Okay, there may be a few shortcuts, but mostly it's communication between adjacent levels. And the reason I bring this up is because the brain seems to use this hierarchical structure. So this is like your typical neural network. Okay, so you have when I say neural network, I mean neural network model, the ones that for example, use deep learning and so on. So this is the input layer, and then this is the output layer, and in between you have large number of layers, the hidden layers, which is where you employ deep learning. Okay, but this itself is inspired by actually the way we think the brain neural network is constructed. So the input layers actually correspond to our sensory neurons. So for example, here from the eye, some stimulus is entering the sensory neurons in our retina, and the hidden layers correspond to interneurons. So this stimuli go on to excite further layers, for example, the primary visual cortex in the brain, and finally the output layer correspond to motor neurons, which when excited leads to certain appropriate action. So if you're a cataphobe, that means you try to run away as soon as possible, but if you're a lover of cats, the action would correspond to actually going to the cat and trying to stroke it. The problem is, this is all very fine in theory. Okay, your typical high school textbook would have shown you this picture. Okay, this multi-layered structure. Is it true? How do you actually find this layered structure for an actual brain? Okay, so you take a like a a string of beads like this, and if you tangle it up, it's not very clear what the sequential ordering of these beads are. And so you would say, okay, you take this string of beads, you pull at both ends, and immediately it becomes clear that this bead is before this bead is before this bead is before this bead, right? It's easy to do for a string, but is there an analogical thing we can do for the brain? So there's a very nice book written by Sebastian Swing who's by the way, a wonderful speaker. If you have seen his TED talk, if you haven't seen it, you should go and see it. He's a very nice speaker. So he wrote this book called Connectome, and he's a very strong believer that the connectome is I. Okay, so or in other words, all information about what you are can be discerned by just figuring out the pattern of connections of your brain. And so he has a passage in his book where he says that, look, when you look at a bird and you look at how it generates its song, you realize that it's using a string of neurons called HVC neurons. It doesn't matter what its name is. And so what is happening is each neuron in the sequence is excited, then it excites the next neuron in the sequence, which excites the next neuron in the sequence, which excites the next neuron in the sequence, and this is actually generating the song. Okay? So he says that it's a bit like this, that as each of these neurons in turn are excited, you get the different syllables of the bird song. Okay? So as the activity wave proceeds along this, basically the song unfolds in time. Okay? The problem is, when you map out the brain, it's not conveniently shown to you like this. It will actually tangled up like this. It's the same network, but it's all tangled up. So how do you untangle this mess and you show that it's actually this neat structure of a chain? Okay? So here, for example, you can look at each of these nodes and their connections in turn and laboriously try to lay it out on a sequence, but you can't do this by hand for any large network. It's not like a string that you can pull at both ends. So back in 90s, two people actually tried to do this for the visual areas in macaque, just the visual area. Okay, you can see the mess, right? And they couldn't actually do it with just the information about what connects to what alone. They had to use anatomical information like, how does this region look? Okay, if this region looks different, then, this region must be different from this. And so let's see if they're neighboring and so on. So they're using like all kinds of heuristic, rules of thumbs and so on. And we still don't know whether it's correct or not. Okay, this is just their reconstruction. So what we're asking is, if you give the adjacency matrix of the brain areas, just using this information, can you find the hierarchy? So essentially, it becomes a problem of graph theory. Okay? You have given a matrix and you want to arrange it in layers such that most of the connections would be between a layer and its immediately preceding and immediately succeeding layers. You want to turn it into a sequential set of layered set of nodes. Okay. All right, so how do we do this? So let's first take a step back and see how do we do it for modules. So modules, you remember, are basically groups of nodes which are communities. And so let's say you want to identify, that these set of nodes hang together. These set of nodes hang together. This set of nodes hang together. Now, if I give you an adjacency matrix, what does this mean? It means I want to identify a roughly block diagonal structure. Is that clear? If that's not clear, just ask. Why does modularity imply that the adjacency matrix should have a block diagonal structure? Precisely, very good. So if you look at this one, okay, so these are dense connections and these are sparse connections. So this means that this is one module, this is another module. These nodes are all talking to each other very densely. These nodes are talking to each other very densely, but between them there is very few connections, right? And so this is what you want to identify. But you start out with a network which looks like this, all scrambled up. So that means you have to interchange the rows and columns until you get as close to a block diagonal structure as possible. Okay? How do we do that? Okay. Now, of course, the idea that the brain is modular is itself not new. So the pseudoscience of phrenology, which was proposed by Franz Gall back in the 18th century, actually had this notion that if you have a bump here, that means you have acquisitiveness. If you have a bump here, that means you're a very hopeful person, and so on. And of course, this has undergone vast advances in recent times, as you can see. This is a joke. Okay. This is meant as a joke. Don't take this seriously. Okay. This is a, one of those things where they say, what is the difference between a male brain and a female brain? Okay. I like this one. The area in the male brain which apparently is given to cooking, washing, ironing, romance, commitment, emotions, excluding football. But seriously, how do you determine the modules? So Mark Newman, a fantastic physicist, in 2004 gave this wonderful idea. He said, look, why don't we devise a metric which he called the modularity index, which basically asks what's the probability that two nodes, given their number of connections, would be connected with each other simply by chance. Okay. What's the probability that if you have A connections and if I have B connections, and in total there are L connections, that you and I will be connected, it will be proportional to the product of your connections and my connections divided by the total number of connections, right? And so that's what this is. The probability that if I has Ki connections and J has Kj connections and L is the total number of connections, then this is the factor which tells you the probability that just by chance I and J would be connected. Aij, on the other hand, actually gives you the real connection probability, 0 or 1. Right? So what you're measuring is the difference between the two for nodes belonging to each module. So remember, this delta Ci Cj is 1 only if I and J are in the same community. So you are saying that if you're in the same community, then is it that you have a higher than random chance of being connected? Okay. So if the number of connections within a community is no more or no less than what is expected by chance, then overall this would sum to 0. Okay, so for a random network you will go to 0. If Q is greater than 0, that means you have a higher than random chance of two nodes within a particular community of being connected. Okay. If it is less than 0, what does it imply? That means nodes in the same community are avoiding each other, okay, which of course violates the whole concept of a modularity. Okay. All right. So now you will say, hold on a sec, aren't you putting the cart before the horse? You are already using this idea that I and J are in the same community, but that is what we wanted to find out in the first place. So, isn't it a circular problem? To use this, I need to know who are in the same community. Okay. So what Newman said was, look, this is what's going to give us a concept of how to find the modularity. You start with a random guess, okay, and then you make changes to the random guess and ask, has Q increased? If it has increased, you accept it. If it's not, you reject it with a certain probability. Then you again make some changes. You ask, has Q increased further? If it has, you accept the move. And so on, you keep doing this until you can no longer increase Q. And then you stop and you say that this is the modular organization of the network. Okay. And it's nice because now it just becomes a problem of combinatorial optimization. Okay. So you can use your favorite algorithm like simulated annealing or whatever. Okay. So using these kinds of techniques, you can look at the macaque brain and you find 5 densely connected communities. So these correspond to the different colors. So these are the different projections of the brain. This is looking at it from above, this is looking at it from the front, and this is looking at it from the side. Okay. And moreover, you can actually ask what is the purpose of each of these brain regions. So some of these nodes, some of these brain regions are basically acting as connectors between different modules. Some of these brain regions are basically acting as local hubs. So they basically talk to all the members in your own community. So they're like local leaders. These are leaders who also help to connect other nodes. And these are satellite connectors which they're completely unimportant either in their own group or in other groups, but they help to make different groups connect to each other. So using this idea, you can actually help to identify the importance of a particular node. So in case it's not, this looks too abstract, just think of this. You go to a new institution and you want to find out who are the movers and shakers. What do? Well, you could do one thing. You could hang around each department and you see whose office is being visited most often. Okay. Probably it's going to be the head of the department. But the people who are going there are just probably going to get something signed and so on. Okay. So this is like the local hubs. They are very central to their own group, but probably in the larger scheme of things they're unimportant. So how do you figure out who is important in the bigger scheme of things? You go to the canteen and see whose table is like everybody wants to be in. Right? So this guy is like the life of the thing. Right? And the thing is that this person may not be, might be a postdoc or a PhD student, right? But everybody wants to talk to her or him, right? So what happens is this person is acting as the clearinghouse of information from various departments, because she is kind of connecting all these different departments together. So in terms of importance in its own department, maybe very far below the ranking, but as a connector plays a very, very important role. So that's a satellite connector. But of course then you have the head honcho, the director, right, who kind of is not only important in terms of the departments but also helping connect all the departments together, right? So each of them played very different roles. And you ask, okay, what's the level of connections between all these different roles? Okay. And so using this you can figure out that there is certain ways in which information actually flows across the brain. So for example, the local hubs essentially send most of the information to peripheral nodes which have a strong connection with the connector hubs, and then this has an exchange of information with these satellite connectors which then send information to the local nodes. So by using this circuit, so to say, you actually have information flowing both within each community and also between communities. You can also relate the modules to brain function. So for example, you can look at these various modules. So this is module 1, module 2, module 3, module 4, module 5, and you can see each of them is actually responsible for certain sensory processing. So module 5 is entirely given over to visual, module 2 is entirely given over to touch, module 1 is given over to the sense of smell, module 4 is given over to hearing. The third module, interestingly, is not connected with any sensory stimulus, it's actually connected with formation of memory and emotional responses. Okay. So it kind of functions almost like another sensory stimulus. Okay. All right. And you also see that these connectors are the ones which develop first before all the other nodes. So let's go back to the hierarchy now. Now using the same thing that we did, that Mark Newman did for modules, what my student Anand figured out was, hey folks, what we can do is we can use this idea that what is the probability that two nodes which are adjacent to which are in adjacent layers will talk to each other just by chance. So it will be the product of the incoming connections of the ith node and the outgoing connections of the jth node, where I and j are adjacent layers, divided by the total number of directed connections. And you subtract this from the actual connections and voila, you have a measure called h, which will be 0 if it is completely random, but which will be greater than 0 if there is a hierarchical structure. So if you properly arrange it, this is what it will look like. So the connections are dense between two successive layers. So that's why you have this band diagonal structure, and it's sparse everywhere else, including within each of these layers. So you can use your favorite optimization algorithm where you start with some completely arbitrarily arranged network, then you keep making these moves so that gradually you increase h, and finally you get this output where everything is neatly arranged into layers. So we first tried it out with artificially constructed networks. So we construct a network which has a clear hierarchical structure, then we randomly shuffle them so that all the structure is lost, then we run the algorithm and we get back the original structure almost. Okay, there's still some errors, but you can mostly get back the original structure. So going back to the macaque, we ran this and we found that you can actually arrange all this all these brain areas into 16 layers. So the colors basically stand for layers 1 to 16. And so starting from the blue layer, it goes all the way to this red layers. Now, what does this mean in terms of information processing? So the stimulus is entering in this occipital lobe, which goes into the temporal lobe and then to the frontal lobe. So this is like our upstream pathway. But there's also feedback where from frontal lobe through the parietal lobe, we are going back to the occipital lobe. So this we call the downstream pathway. So this we said is where sensory stimulus is being analyzed in successive areas so that high level processing can be done at the frontal lobe. And then this high level processing gives you some information which then goes back as feedback back to the input initial layer so that you can further filter the sensory stimulus you're having. Moreover, there's a very interesting connection between the modules and the hierarchical layer. So you can see that each of the modules can be divided into hierarchies. So it's a nice picture where each module is actually made out of a hierarchy of layers, and they are kind of working parallel to each other. So you get qualitatively very similar results for a human brain, similar arrangement of the modules into hierarchical levels, and of course also for the lowly worm, the C. elegans, which tells you that maybe this is a universal pattern. Okay, so again you see these modules can be divided into hierarchical layers. So what is the picture that we came up with? So it seems that our brains have both a modular character. So this is one module, this is another module, this is another module, but there's also a hierarchical arrangement of the nodes within each of these modules. And so what's happening is that sometimes you get these shortcuts, let's say going from this layer to this layer in this module, or this layer to this layer in this module. But overall, there is both a hierarchical structure, and then each of these hierarchies are packed into some kind of a module. Now, this tells you that maybe there is a reason why both of these structures actually are occurring in all kinds of brains. Why do you need modularity? Well, you need multiple independent units to work in parallel on different kinds of sensory stimulus. So one module would be working on visual stimulus, one module would be working on auditory stimulus, another module would be working on olfactory stimulus. Within vision itself, we'll have multiple modules, one working on motion, one working on form, one working on color. Each of these things are working in parallel, in tandem, right? But then you need to have hierarchy because you need to abstract out the information. The brain can't handle the huge amount of information that is being arriving at it every millisecond. So it has to take out what is the information which is most important. How do you do that? You do that by actually filtering it through layer after layer so that eventually only the key information is kept. So you need both modularity and hierarchy. You need both parallel processing and serial processing. And so having modular hierarchies provide you the best of both worlds. So it allows for distributed processing, and it has a which basically comes from the modular organization, but it also has this hierarchy which allows you the efficient processing of sensory information. Okay, so hopefully I'm in time. So conclusions, this network science or graph theory gives us a way of uncovering the hierarchical organization across very different species which are effective across scales, which doesn't depend upon whether the links are direct or undirected, and whether there are already other existing structures like modules. And the results kind of tell us something about all these debates as to whether the brain is doing sequential processing or distributed processing, as in modular systems, by suggesting there's a new kind of architecture which combines the best of both worlds, modular hierarchies. Okay. All right, so I'd like to thank the people who were involved in the work. So this work was part of the PhD thesis of my former student Anand Pathak, who finished his PhD I think 2022, and is currently a postdoc at Dartmouth. Shakti, who is a scientific officer at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, was closely associated with this work. And some of the earlier work on the worm was done in collaboration with Nivedita, who is in Vishnu Foundation at Shankanetralaya, Chennai. So if you are interested, you can look up this thing in 2 papers we published. So this is this hierarchy work is actually published in PNAS last year, and the work on modularity and how it helps in communication was published in PhysRev in 2022. So, and of course, I would like to acknowledge generous funding from the Department of Atomic Energy. So that's it. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah, go on. Okay, excellent question. So you're absolutely right that it doesn't have a very neat hierarchical structure. So see, the starting assumption is that hierarchy means that most of the communication, by the way, this communication can be two-way. So actually feedback can occur even in a hierarchical structure, but only between successive layers. Okay. So if it was a completely hierarchical system, then it would be only this, okay, and it would correspond to a structure like this. So this is occupied, this is occupied. So that means these 2 layers are talking to each other. Then this is occupied, this is occupied. So this would correspond to the hierarchy index being maximal. Okay. In reality, of course, you would get things like this. Okay. So this means that some of these things would be occupied also. Okay. So that means H will drop, but it won't go to 0. If it's 0, that means effectively everything is homogeneously connected. Okay. So by looking at what is the value of H correspond to this complete arbitrary, the perfect case where there is no connection whatsoever between non-adjacent layers, one can actually work out what fraction of links would be doing the shortcuts. But yes, in reality, of course, you will have all these shortcut connections across layers. Well, one thing I can speculate is that this allows for very rapid spread of specialized information. See, in order to suppose, take a look at the company, for example. Okay, typically the information would be going from the shop floor all the way to the top management and then come back, right? This takes a long time. Okay, typically there's a lot of paper pushing and so on. Okay, but sometimes what will happen is that maybe the shop floor person will just tell this to a friend who has the ear of the head honcho, like the CEO secretary, right? So the CEO secretary basically then quickly informs the CEO, and a very quick information comes down, right? So there could be informal channels which allows very rapid communication. Okay, and so it could be that for certain tasks you need very rapid communication, okay, which is where the shortcuts might be coming in handy. Okay, but one has to be careful with this analogy because there's a reason why you need all these layers, and that is because the brain is not equipped for handling unprocessed raw information that is coming in. So if you look at visual information, for example, we are not conscious of it, but our brain is being hit by zillions of photons, okay, all the time. Right? How do I ignore all of this information and just focus on you? Okay, I mean, I'll be swamped with information. In fact, that's one of the hallmarks of schizophrenia. In schizophrenia, you lose this ability to filter. Okay, so tap water, a tap dripping is something you can't filter out. See, normally, a tap dripping somewhere in the corner, but to a person who's in acute schizophrenia, this tap dripping is like a constant irritant. See, when I entered the room, I immediately heard the AC wiring, right? But after some time, I completely filtered it out. But person with schizophrenia won't be able to filter it out. So a lot of this hierarchical processing has to do with filtering out information which is not necessary for my immediate use. Okay, so having shortcuts may look like a wonderful thing, but it's only when something is very, very urgent that you need such shortcuts, because otherwise it will be deadly. Okay, as far as the brain is concerned, the less the better. Okay. Yeah. 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 Uh, nice question. Yeah. No, so the hierarchical structures can be deeper. So you saw that that's because we're not talking about the hierarchy of the neurons, we're talking about the hierarchy of the brain regions. Okay, the neurons are 6 layers deep because roughly that's the thickness of the cortex, the cortical layer that is going around, the what we call the gray matter of the brain. So you can actually see it. So if you take a section of the brain, so this is roughly the human brain. So this is the cerebellum. So if you look at, so of course the brain is very convoluted, right? But if you look at the surface, there's a very thin layer of neurons, okay, which of course is crumpled because actually if you spread it out, it will cover a much larger area. So in order to put that larger area in over a much smaller sized object, you basically crumple it up like this. Okay. The number of neurons or the depth of the neurons is actually not a good indicator of how many hierarchical layers there would be in the number of regions, which is a different thing altogether. Okay. But for the C. elegans, which is actually a completely different things, which it doesn't have a cerebral cortex. I mean, it just has this loose diffuse connected network. Actually, the number of layers is not very high. So you can basically see that it kind of roughly corresponds to something like that order, what you mentioned. Okay. Okay.